Hi, and thanks for hitting the snooze button. My name is Neil Headley. Welcome to episode 2. Yep, we are official and underway now. A few things to pass on before we officially get into episode 2. First of all, kind of a surprise thank you going out to a handful of people who've already signed up to become bedheads. Bedheads are a fun little nickname for the people who have decided to support the show by chipping in a couple of bucks. We'll have more details on that at the end of the show and in the show notes as well. But to establish the premise of the whole project, we needed to get into what, in my line of work, we would call a scene setter, a little into the woods on how I got here with my sleeplessness issues and the things it takes to get me set up for the journey. It's going to mean that the first handful of episodes here on the snooze button are a little more science heavy than what's going to be the norm, because we're trying to end, for me, a 30-year sleep drought and hopefully take care of your sleep issues along the way. But I got to figure out how bad my sleep is first. And we don't know that till I go and lie down in a lab for a sleep study. And that's, don't even get me started on how ridiculous a concept that is. But if I'm going to track what's working and what isn't, well, then whose numbers are we going to depend on for that? Like, if I'm going to wear a sleep tracker, is it a tracker that the scientists actually believe is good? Well, I don't know that till I talk to scientists about what makes a good tracker. So I'll loop you in on that conversation as well, because before you run out and get your next smartwatch, hold on. Maybe you're getting one that's, going to give you a load of bad data back. We're going to track that for you. Early on in this series, we're also going to take a couple of detours for some timely conversations with a couple of authors who have sleep-related projects of their own that are in the hopper. We'll clue you in on that as well. But let's get to it. Let's get to episode 2. I wanted to make sure that for the first guest I had, a heavy hitter or somebody that I've referred to before as a neuroscience rock star. Funny sidebar on this. It wasn't until after I had used that term I found out he actually is a rock star. He's the frontman and the lead guitar player for an all-scientist band, if you can imagine that, called Untidy Naked Dilemma. Now, before you go casting aspersions, let's keep in mind that, Brian May from Queen has a PhD in astrophysics. So, as they say in the medical community, don't jump to contusions. When I used the term rock star initially, it was because this year, Dr. Adrian Owen was made an Officer of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, which is a huge deal. He was inducted into that select group for his services to scientific research. So in this conversation, and by the way, right out of the gate, this is not the best foot forward that I was hoping for in terms of audio quality. We discovered after the interview had been recorded that our gear kind of let us down, but we figured out how to rectify that going forward. So without any further ado, here is Dr. Adrian Owen. First of all, thank you for making time for this today. I appreciate it. The question that I've decided we're going to start every episode of this adventure with is, how'd you sleep last night?
Actually, I slept pretty poorly last night.
Really?
Yeah, it was my first night back after a vacation. So I was in a new bed, in my own bed, for the first time in 10 days. And I don't know why, but I was up for 2 hours between 2 and 4, just unable to sleep. But I've learned to just get up and try and make use of that time in the middle of the night rather than lying in bed fretting about it.
Is that what you're supposed to do? Because I keep hearing that among the things that people do wrong when they have sleep issues is they do exactly that. They lie there and they think to themselves, why am I not sleeping? And they quote unquote try to get to sleep.
Yeah, I don't think there's any real rules about, what you should do. I mean, certainly for me, I have experienced the same thing that many people experience as they get older. Around the time I turned 50, I started to sort of sleep less and to typically wake up after 4 or 5 hours sleep. I would be completely wide awake and it would be 3 a.m. And yeah, for the first year or so, I would lie tossing and turning, fretting, trying to try different types of legal drugs to put me back to sleep and things. None of that really worked. And I just embraced it, really. And now I just think, okay, I'm going to get up and watch a movie, or I don't work because that tends to get my mind thinking about other things that I then feeds into the sleeplessness problem. So I'll do something relaxing. But people deal with these things in very different ways.
So out of all of the different disciplines of science, neuroscience and specifically sleep, talk to me about that as a career path for you. What led you down this road?
Well, I guess first to be really clear, I'm not a sleep expert. Sleep is a sort of I guess something that I use to investigate consciousness. So what I really do and what I'm really interested in is consciousness. And my career, I started as a neuroscientist, and my career really started in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when brain imaging or functional brain imaging techniques like PET or positron emission tomography and functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI as we call it, those things were really coming online. And I was always a bit of a computer geek, and I was also very interested in the brain. And of course, this is the perfect marriage of those two things. The brain and computers, brain imaging is where those two things intersect. And in many ways, I was in the right place at the right time. I was working in the right places. I did a postdoc here in Canada, in Montreal, at the Montreal Neurological Institute, which was one of the big early imaging centres. And I was back at the University of Cambridge in the UK, which also got into imaging fairly early, particularly imaging of people with damage to their brain. So I got a lot of experience of that. And then about 20 years ago, I started to get intrigued by this problem of understanding consciousness, but particularly in understanding consciousness in patients who have been rendered unconscious, for want of a better expression. And these were typically patients who'd had a severe brain injury and were in a condition like a coma or a vegetative state, or some of these patients had what we call locked-in syndrome, where they were perfectly conscious but nevertheless not able to respond. And I, with my imaging experience, became interested in whether we could use brain imaging to try and, if you like, unlock the brains of these patients. Can we get to find out what's going on for these people? And I guess I never would have dreamed it would have turned my whole career around, but that's, my entire career got into that area, partly because I think we were pretty successful. Some of the earliest patients we started to see, we found that they were diagnosed as being in a vegetative state, which most people would assume meant they had no conscious awareness of where they were and where they are, who they are, and the situation they were in. And we were starting to find patients who clearly did have some awareness. And then we, in the mid-2000s, late 2000s, started developing techniques to actually detect those patients who were aware. And eventually we managed to communicate with some of these people, actually using brain imaging to get them to change their brain activity to communicate with us, despite the fact that they wouldn't say anything, wouldn't look anywhere. They wouldn't, if you asked them to look left or right or squeeze your hand or kick their foot, they would do none of those things. They were entirely non-responsive patients. And this opened up a whole new world of consciousness research to me, because I could see this was an interesting way of trying to understand the differences between levels, if you like, of consciousness, types of conscious awareness. And of course, sleep is the only sort of state that is an altered state of consciousness that all of us go through in health, hopefully every day of our lives. And so this is, sorry, a very long answer to your question, but this is how I came to...
Podcasters love long answers.
Okay.
Are you kidding me?
Well, this is how I came to get into sleep, because these patients, with serious brain injuries, whilst extremely fascinating, and although they can tell us an awful lot about things like consciousness, they're still relatively few and far between. And whereas sleeping people are all over the place. We all sleep, and it's very straightforward getting people into the lab, getting them to sleep, looking at what that means for how their brain works, looking at how sleep deprivation affects their cognitive function, these sorts of questions. So, again, I say this because my background is not in sleep. It's something I came into because I could see it's a vehicle, if you like, for doing research on altered states of awareness or altered states of consciousness.
This can be an area of controversy for some people, because you and I are not of what I like to say entirely dissimilar vintage. And when you start talking to people about someone who's in a vegetative state, the name that jumps to mind for a lot of people, because she was the subject of a lot of controversy in the United States, Terri Schiavo. And there became questions of, consent consent and things like that, all related to people who, as you say, were completely non-responsive. So has that research opened any doors in that area? Would it, for example, have made Terri Schiavo's case clearer had it been around when her story was in front of everyone?
So that's a really very, very good question. And she was absolutely a landmark case. I mean, everybody, I was living in the UK at the time, but everybody around the world knew about the Terri Schiavo case. And I think in many ways, it was I don't think it would be wrong to describe it as a huge circus in many ways. What was interesting about it for me is, I said earlier that, this sort of work opened up a whole new world of research opportunities and possibilities. And one thing that cases like Schiavo's case did is started to bring in things like ethics and the law. And this is the thing I found very intriguing about working in that area, is that it was no longer just neuroscience for neuroscience sake. I would be seeing a patient who might be the subject of a legal case to withdraw treatment or not withdraw treatment, or would be the subject of an intense ethical debate about the rights or not that these patients should or shouldn't have in these situations. So it's interesting. Over the last 20 years or so, working in that area, I've got involved in many legal meetings, ethical meetings, religious meetings, because obviously I'm not a religious person, but there are many. Often the way that these cases are dealt with in different countries depends on the religious orientation of many of the people in that country, and so you have these great cultural differences between otherwise equally civilized societies that are just down to the sort of local religious circumstances that I also find quite intriguing. Just to give you a direct answer to your question about Terri Schiavo, I wrote about this in my book on this, that she's an interesting case because it's interesting when a case like that becomes the sort of landmark, because if you were going to design this and say, well, let's come up with a quotes poster child for this problem, you wouldn't have picked Terri Schiavo. She had extremely distributed brain damage. She was not a person who could have ever recovered from her injuries. And some patients do recover. It's not that nobody ever does, but she was not in the category of people that we would have looked at and said she has a chance of recovery. There was no evidence that Terri Schiavo had any conscious awareness, despite various parties arguing to the contrary. There was no good scientific evidence, and nor was there any reason why she should have done, because the damage to her brain was so extensive that really awareness could not possibly have been preserved. So in many ways, I mean, she was a very typical patient. I've seen many patients like Terri Schiavo over the years. But she wasn't the sort of patient that you would pick out and say, well, let's use her to really put this stuff on the map. Likewise, early on in her treatment, she'd had something called deep brain stimulation, which is a technique where they put implant electrodes deep into your brain to, if you like, to jumpstart your brain. The problem with that technique for her is it left these electrodes in her brain, which meant that she actually could have never gone into an MRI machine, because the one thing you don't want to have is any metal in your body when you go into an MRI machine. Right. So sort of again, just for a practical reason, Terri Schiavo, I mean, not only do I not believe she would have shown any evidence of awareness had we got her into a brain scanner. She couldn't have got into most brain scanners to start with, or at least not using the techniques that we developed. So she was an interesting. It's interesting for me that she became such a huge international story, and I can't pretend that for the field that that wasn't. I hesitate to say a good thing, but it made people, it increased public awareness of this problem, and in that sense, it probably did translate into research interest and research dollars. But she's not the patient that I would have chosen if I was set out to try and make a case for this being an important area for research.
I think for a lot of people, and forgive me if this is maybe a geographically specific reference. I think for a lot of people, their first exposure to the idea, because you talk about how some people can recover. First people, their exposure to the idea of neuroplasticity probably came, and forgive me if you've never seen it, from an episode of House that had Dave Matthews on it, playing this young piano prodigy who ended up in the episode getting a hemispherectomy, which 99% of the people watching House had never even heard the word before. And then the question was, is he ever going to be able to play again? And then the episode dealt with this idea that, no, your brain can reassign tasks to different parts of it. You're nodding your head like you know the episode I'm talking about.
Actually, I thought I'd seen every episode of House, and I probably did. And it probably means I've forgotten this one because I'm 53 now and I forget a lot of things. But I can completely imagine it. I love the show, actually. I watched it for many years, so I thought I'd watched every episode. The one that actually really sticks in my mind, and this is possibly the point that I stopped watching it, was the woman who was in a coma, who House, one of his colleagues managed to bring her out of a coma just long enough for her to go off and gamble all of her worldly goods, and then come back and get back into bed. And there was some complicated relationship between who was going to inherit what, and her relationship with various people. And I think in the end, I think they woke her up long enough to consent to donate an organ to one of her relatives. I think that's what it was. And, this stuff I used to think, and probably the time that episode went out, this was the stuff of science fiction, but it was probably 10 years on now. And it's not that far from the realm of possibility. I'm not so sure about your Dave Matthews story. That still sounds a little bit far-fetched to me, but
it's worth digging for the episode if you've ever got time to kill on YouTube, if for nothing else other than the scene where Hugh Laurie and Dave Matthews are playing I Don't Like Mondays on the piano together. It's just a great little piece of television. One of the things I find interesting, and I'd love to get your perspective on it as a neuroscientist, is I feel like the two areas of science where I would have thought we would have had it nailed down by now are eating and sleeping, because they're the two things, maybe the only two things, activities anyway, that everybody on the planet does. And yet it feels like every day there's another huge food study coming out that probably disproves half a dozen other food studies. And I have a Google alert set to send me an email every time there's a new sleep study that's published. And there's new stuff in my inbox every day. It amazes me because this is the one place where we all have common ground, but we still have a lot to learn.
So I wonder whether you can flip that argument on its head and say, well, the reason that one of the reasons these are two very complicated things as well, but also it's just because it's so much part of life. I think we just sleep, right? It's just something you do. It's a bit like breathing, it's just a thing that we do. And therefore, it's a little bit harder perhaps for people to sort of focus on it as being something that requires attention. I mean, it also, I can't speak for eating. I know absolutely nothing about eating apart from the fact that I eat and I enjoy it. But sleeping, I think it's something because we all do, and most of us do it fairly routinely for at least, most of our lives. It's not something that really demands much of our attention, probably. I think it's very interesting. I mean, when we conducted, what we called the world's largest sleep study, which I think where you and I first started to interact a couple of years ago, that study, I was really amazed that very many really basic things about sleep were incredibly poorly understood. I mean, about all I really we knew about sleep was, well, about 8 hours seems to be how much people should try and get. But actually, when you dig into that and you look at the science behind where that number comes from, it's very hard to get to the bottom of it. Similarly, how much sleep is enough? Okay, maybe 8 hours is the right amount, but is 6 enough to get by? Or, what happens if you only have 4? I mean, as I say, I think one of the reasons why a lot of these things, these really quite straightforward questions are still unanswered is, in fact, there are many reasons, but one of them is that there's tremendous variability in the population, and anything you have that's normal but very variable is very hard to tie down unless you can do a very large population study. So, I might sit and interview you about your sleeping habits, and what we do as scientists, or as neuroscientists anyway, we typically look at a small group of people, work out how their brains do something, and then extrapolate that up to the rest of the population. That's typically how it works. And the bigger the N you can get, the larger the number of people you can get involved in your study, the closer you are likely to be to the habits of or the behavior of the general population. But of course, that becomes unstuck if you're talking about something that's very variable. And sleep is very variable. There's plenty of people that get by just fine on less than 8 hours sleep. There's plenty of people that feel they need much more than that. So yes, you have this tremendous variability that makes it hard to study unless you can get at very large numbers of people. And there have been relatively few extremely large studies of sleep. It's something that, as we found, is becoming much easier to do now with the internet, because you can get at people and you can get people to report on their habits through the internet, which means you can get much larger numbers together. You haven't got to get everybody into the lab. It's much easier. The other thing about something like sleep is I feel that it's one of those, and we're discovering this in a lot of areas of neuroscience now, that things that were investigated relatively early. So sleep is relatively easy to investigate compared to, for example, patients in a coma in a scanner. Putting people to sleep in my lab and looking at what happens to them is pretty easy to do. And so people have been doing that sort of thing for decades. People have been doing sleep studies since long before I was born, and because of that, a lot of the work was done early on, and it hasn't been revisited. Science has this way of sort of moving on and moving on and moving on. And I think sleep might be one of these things that was very big in the 70s. A lot of people looking at sleep because we didn't have brain imaging machines back then, and we had fairly rudimentary ways of measuring human physiology. So people did a lot of behavioral work on putting people to sleep or depriving people of sleep and then seeing how they performed. And a lot of that stuff, is now very old and does need to be revisited. And of course, with all the new amazing tools we have available to us now, we can revisit some of them.
Wow, there's 37 places I want to go here. I'm fascinated by all this stuff. Talk to me about this, as you called it, the world's largest sleep study, because it was massive. And there was, I think, at least for me, there was one major takeaway, but there were piles of takeaways from that study. But the main thing that jumped out at me was, in terms of cognitive ability and performance, there is such a thing as too much sleep, because people get it in their head that, I'm just going to catch up on the weekend and I'm going to bang out 12 hours of sleep and everything will be fine again. No, it's just as bad, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'll tell you a little bit about the study. Technically it wasn't the world's largest sleep study. There have been many studies of hundreds of thousands of people where, people filling questionnaires about how much sleep they do. What it was, I think, was the world's largest sleep study of cognition. So we were specifically interested in looking at how too little sleep, actually, was why we went into the study, affects your cognitive function, your memory, your concentration, your ability to make decisions, to reason, to do these sorts of things. We set it up on the internet. We invited, it was in collaboration with the BBC. They ran a news item on it and encouraged people to log in and do our tests and then tell us a lot of information about their sleeping habits. And really, what we wanted to know was to answer questions like, well, how much are people sleeping? And assuming that people are mostly not getting enough sleep, how is that affecting different aspects of their cognitive function? But you're absolutely right. We learned the answers to those questions, but we got a whole lot more as well. So let me just running sort of through them in the logical order. As you would expect, between 7 and 8 hours seem to be the amount of sleep most people should get. Those people who were reporting 7 to 8 hours were performing cognitively across the board better than everybody else. But over half of our sample, so this was well over 10,000 people, over half of that sample were reporting typically getting less than 6 hours sleep a night. And that was associated with a cognitive impairment. Those people were not performing cognitively as well as people who were getting between 7 and 8 hours of sleep. Now, this is not acute sleep, to use the jargon. This is not people who just didn't get enough sleep last night. These are people's typical sleeping habits. So people would say, I typically get this amount of sleep. And it's that typical number that was associated with poor cognition. And it went right down, rather drastically. So, of course, we had some hundreds of people that reported only getting about 4 hours sleep a night. We're going to get to you eventually, I know. But, these people that were reported getting about 4 hours sleep a night were typically performing like somebody who was almost 10 years older than they are. So, I'm 53. Cognitively, if I only get 4 hours sleep a night, I'm performing like a 63-year-old. So it's putting 10 years on you, which, is not something to ignore, I think. But returning to your original point, what was the real surprise to us was the too much sleep. So this was really what we call an inverted U-shaped curve. There was a sort of a hump in the middle between 7 and 8 hours where people were cognitively doing really well. But to the left side of that curve, people with less sleep were performing poorly, but also to the right side, people were performing poorly to about the same extent. So, if you were getting if you were sleeping for 12 hours a night, that was just as bad for you as if you were getting 4 hours less than you typically should.
So let's look at, based on that, and I don't know if the research points in this direction, but let's look at some hard-charging type A who is remarkably successful in their life and their career, despite the fact that they only get 5 or 6 hours sleep a night. Is there any evidence that suggests, and maybe even the study points that way, that as successful as they are, and they might be looking at their own life and thinking, well, I messed with a good thing. I've obviously got everything nailed. Why do I want to tweak it? Is there still a whole other level that they could sort of, to borrow a term from earlier in the conversation, unlock by getting another hour or two of sleep that they're not even aware of it yet?
Yeah, I really like the way you framed that question because, that's exactly the point, that none of us know what our true potential could be, right? And we may all feel that we're operating. I'm sure this is true of those people who, are just getting too little sleep and it's really affecting their cognition. They probably feel fine. They probably feel that they're doing as well as they could. But, just like those people, that are these overachievers that we're talking about, perhaps they could do even better with sleep. There's another nuance here that I think is really important, and this relates to sort of earlier research that, or at least I can relate it to earlier research that I did on different aspects of cognition and the brain. And that is that not every aspect of cognition was affected in the same way. So too little and too much sleep really impairs people's reasoning ability. That's sort of one aspect of cognition. So reasoning is I mean, it's a bit of an oversimplification to just lump it all under reasoning, but basically, let's think about decision making. And we make hundreds of decisions every day of our lives. And they could be really big, important decisions like, should I get divorced, or should I buy that house or that car? Equally, they could be trivial decisions like, do I have time to drop by the store on my way to pick up my kid from school? Am I going to do this before that? Have I remembered to call the babysitter about, these sorts of things that, everyday decisions and plans that we all make. Those add up to hundreds of things that you do every day. And decision making, as we assessed it through our cognitive test, was really profoundly affected by both not getting enough sleep and getting too much. Now, on the other hand, memory was almost completely unaffected. And I think people will be surprised by that, because when a lot of people think about cognition, they think, oh, that must be memory. You get Alzheimer's disease. We know that it affects cognition. People lose their memory. But there's a lot more to cognition than simply memory. Although memory is an extremely important aspect of cognition. And it surprised us that memory wasn't affected. So, what that means is if you, for whatever reason, are only getting 4 or 5 hours sleep at the moment, you might not want to make an important decision like, should I buy that car, or should I invest in these stocks or whatever? But probably your memory will be unaffected. And relating that to your original question, people in life can get by with strengths and weaknesses. This is something we know about people's cognitive profiles, as we refer to. There are some people, I guess the best analogy I can come up with is the absent-minded professor, right? We all, have heard that term before, and certainly, maybe I'm one myself, but there are certainly kinds of people like that around, people who are tremendously successful in their field of study, but don't seem to be able to remember anything, or I certainly have many colleagues who have no spatial memory at all. They can't get themselves from one place to another.
Can't find the car in the parking lot of the mall.
But nevertheless, tremendously successful people. And this speaks to variability in cognition, among individuals. That there are people who have very, very good memories, but very poor reasoning. Very good verbal abilities. They can articulate themselves very well, but maybe they don't have very good memories. And and because of that, there are many routes to success cognitively, if you like. And I'm not saying I think on the face of it, one would assume that a very high functioning individual, maybe a CEO of a major companies, is going to have good reasoning abilities, but not necessarily. Maybe they have extremely good memory, very good memory for who's working for them, what they do, what their needs are, what their main tasks are. And this can get people by in difficult situations.
So I'm really hyper conscious of your time, but every time you give me an answer, you flip on 10 other lights about something that I want to follow up on.
I'll try to give shorter answers.
No, it's good. Because one of the things, and this might be a light bulb for some other people too, is when you start talking about cognitive day-to-day decisions, would it be accurate to suggest that in terms of just what seems like a routine cognitive decision that might get impacted by not having had enough sleep, even though you don't feel sleepy, you might make the wrong decision about the question, is now a good time to make that lane change?
Yeah, absolutely. And this was really, I think, at the heart of our study, was that, it's really clear, just from, as you said earlier, just from, the numbers of sort of feeds that are coming in from the news and from various, alerts that we have, that this is a problem, that people generally are not getting enough sleep. And I guess that what we really wanted to look at is this actually having, and because you don't want to get alarmist about something that's not actually a problem, and and it's important that this is why we do science. You've got to find out, well, is this actually a problem? Is this something that we should worry about? And my answer is yes, it is. That decision making and problem solving and reasoning are absolutely fundamental aspects of our everyday lives, we are, barely a few minutes will go by in somebody's life where they are not making some kind of decision. And it may be that decision, it may be, do I have time if I change lanes now to get in front of that car or not? It may be as simple as a decision as that, but that's potentially a fatal decision, right? Or it may be, as I say, something, much more complex. And you're right. I mean, if you don't know that you are impaired in this sense, then maybe we have something serious to worry about.
So it's one of those where if you pick up one end of the stick, you pick up the other one, where this person that we talked about, this fictional type A who might have a whole other gear of achievement that they're not aware of because they're not aware they're impaired. They may also be out there sort of, not to be dramatic about it, but they may be this ticking time bomb in a car that they're assuming simply because I don't feel sleepy. That's not enough to guarantee that they're making the right decision when they're out there sharing the road with the rest of us.
Absolutely. And feeling sleepy and being cognitively impaired are two entirely different things. And the reason we know that is because of this difference between things like memory and reasoning ability. That, if it was just I'm feeling sleepy, then you would expect everything to be impaired, right? We're just a little bit bad at everything because we're just a bit sleepy, groggy, whatever that means, right? That wasn't the case because people's memory is not affected. So this is important for us neuroscientifically because these are what we call dissociations, where not everything is globally affected, but you've got a specific kind of deficit or problem with one type or one or more type of cognitive activities. And this means that it's probably not something that relates to how you feel. It's something that your brain is impaired, but in this way, there are some ways of relating this to alcohol consumption that work well and some ways that don't. I mean, some ways most of us can feel if we've had a drink. There's some feeling that goes along with that, some physiological sense that you've had some alcohol. But that doesn't relate in any direct way to whether or not you're able to drive a car. At least not at low levels. Obviously, there are high levels where we all know there's no way I could drive a car right now. Right. But most of us can't really tell whether our driving will be affected at various sort of low levels of alcohol consumption. And it's similar to that, except sleep, I think, doesn't, at low levels of sleep deprivation, of chronic sleep deprivation, it doesn't have, you don't necessarily, you might be yawning a bit, but you don't necessarily have that obvious sense that I've taken a drug or my brain is being affected.
So without a driver necessarily being drowsy drivers, we've all heard them. Usually people are referring to like long haul truckers when they use that term. But is it possible that there are people out there that simply because they're only getting 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night are more dangerous on the road than a drunk driver is?
Yeah, well, it's completely possible. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very likely. I mean, we try to. There have been various calls around the world to come up with sort of a similar kind of scale to the way we have, drinking driving laws. To have sort of a similar scale, sort of sleeping driving laws is a little bit more difficult, because it's hard to measure. There's not a simple blood test that you can do that'll tell you how much sleep is in somebody's system in the way that you can with alcohol. So it's a bit harder to measure. But I don't think there's any question that many people are impaired. Most of the studies that have been conducted actually have not been with things like driving. They've been with things like looking at shift workers, looking at doctors who are doing very long hours, who have not had sleep. And there's no question at all, I would say, in the literature that there's a very clear relationship between chronic sleep restriction, as I think it would be formally referred to, and performance in any demanding situation, and I would include driving in there.
Is that something that maybe the science world is looking at? Because you say there's no way to test whether or not you've had enough sleep. And in my head, I immediately started thinking, wouldn't it be great if there was a way? You can test for alcohol, you can test for drugs, you can test for cholesterol, wouldn't it be great to find out, unless you already know of something like this, but I started thinking about like the lymphatic system and all these different things, if there was a way to track whether or not, even just moment to moment, have it show up on your Fitbit and have your Fitbit ping you and say, hey, there's a buildup of this or that in your system, you should probably grab a nap.
Yeah, so there's a very straight answer. There is a way of doing this, and this is what we've really been trying to explore. Now, you can't, for practical reasons, as you say, you can't measure the amount of sleep that somebody has had in the way that you can measure the amount, their blood alcohol levels. But you can, of course, measure the outcome, the effects of this. And, in many ways, it's a bit like, in the old days where the police officer would just get you to walk in a straight line, right? They're measuring your behavior. And if you can't walk in a straight line, they figure you can't drive a car either. Don't need to test your blood for that. Obviously it's not completely foolproof, but it's a method. You're looking directly at the behavior and saying, if this person can't walk in a straight line, they also can't drive a car. So we developed these online tools that people can freely take at cambridgebrainsciences.com. Those are the tests we used in the world's largest sleep study. We have hundreds of thousands of people have conducted those tests now. And what we encourage people to do is if they're at all concerned about how sleep is affecting their cognitive behavior, is to go online, take the test. Maybe after you've had a good night's sleep or a few good nights of sleep, take the test. It'll store your scores. You'll know how well you perform on those tests. And then test yourself again when you think you're fine, but you've only had 5.5 hours sleep, and you see the difference. And we know what's going to happen because we have the data from hundreds of thousands of people that have done this and tens of thousands of people that have done the sleep study. But, I think it will be a real eye-opener for people to, you could do it on an individual basis because the software will now compare your performance to everybody else in the database who, is maybe of a similar age to you or a similar background to you. And you can put these variables in so that, it's not skewed by the fact that you're a bit older than other people or, that in a sense is the best method of doing it. It's in some ways, it's better than having a blood test because you're measuring somebody's actual ability. And if you do this and you find your score on our reasoning test is 30% lower after not getting enough sleep than it was when you'd had enough sleep, that should be evidence enough that you probably shouldn't be making any big decisions at the moment.
Okay, so yet another thing I need to do. I love getting homework from you. This is good because let me circle back around to where we can find the test in a minute. Because it was you that I'll never forget the look on your face when I described to you how much sleep I was actually getting, at least according to what my Fitbit is telling me, and some anecdotal evidence from my wife. So my Fitbit says I average about 3.5 hours a night, sometimes 4. Every once in a while, if I've just thrown caution to the wind on a weekend, I'll bust out 5.5 if I'm really lucky. But that's after having been in bed for 7-8 hours. And my wife says, well, that makes sense to me because you tend to spend, she says, the first 2 or 3 hours every night thrashing around like a fish on the deck of a boat. So when I brought that up to you, you said 2 things that were of interest to me. One was that I seemed, and I'll always be grateful that you said this because you're the first person in the world that ever has, that I seem to be performing at a pretty high level for someone who gets that little sleep. Thank you. But second, basically it was get me to a sleep lab. To paraphrase Shakespeare. So you'll be happy to know I'm working on that. That's sometime in the next week or 2. I guess I'm going for an overnight sleep test. Should more people do that? Should that be on the list of to-dos for people? Just get in, see what your sleep's actually like? Or for most of us is, depending on the numbers in our Fitbit, enough?
No. So, joking aside, the reason I said that to you, I think in your case it is absolutely what you should do, and I'm glad you're doing it. But the reason I said it was more a call to get people to to really approach these questions as scientifically as they can. We're not all in the lucky position that I am to have a lab and to run sort of scientific experiments, but you can address questions like, how good or how poor is my sleep perfectly scientifically, in many cases, on your own at home. So, and I'm very passionate about this. It was really just an appeal to, not rely on one sort of general sense of what's going on in the world. So let's go back and talk about my sleep last night. I felt like I got up for 2 hours. I did go to bed early because I was tired, but then I felt like I was basically awake most of the night. I was tossing and turning. I was up and down. I was trying to live a mess. That's what I felt. When I woke up this morning, my Fitbit told me I'd had 7.5 hours sleep, right? So actually, somehow or other, I did quite well, but it was, I think there are some issues of, I don't know how exactly accurate or not the Fitbit is in determining whether you're asleep or not. But, let's say, it's good approximation to how much you've been asleep. But clearly I was wrong. I'd have said to you, I probably got about 3 last night with all the tossing and turning and getting up for 2 hours and not being able to get to sleep in the first place. But actually, apparently, I did pretty well. So I think, and in your case, I think your Fitbit has been, systematically reporting that you've been getting, what I would say is not enough sleep, and that is something that you should look into. But exactly why and when, I remember you telling me that in this period that your wife reports you're sort of thrashing around. By the way, I'm surprised you're still married with all that.
But, the most patient woman ever on so many fronts.
So I think it's important to understand what's going on there. Are you awake or are you asleep? Now, because there's an area where I can imagine your Fitbit might come unstuck, right? Let's just say you're in the first few hours of sleep, you thrash around a lot. You're asleep, but you just move around a lot, right? Your Fitbit is not going to think you're asleep. It's going to think you're awake because it's using various aspects of its accelerometer and your respiration and things like that to determine whether it thinks you're asleep or not. So, I'm not wishing to cast any aspersions on how good or bad a Fitbit is at predicting whether we're asleep, but it can only measure what it can measure, it's entirely possible that you are getting some sleep during that period, despite the fact that your measure of whether you're sleeping or not is telling you you're not. So this is why I was really encouraging you to get into a sleep lab and find out exactly what's happening, because they'll be able to tell you, not based on how much you're thrashing around, but based on an electrophysiology and using electrodes on your head. They will be able to determine whether you are awake or asleep at any given moment with a very high degree of accuracy. And I suspect you'll be surprised. I'm predicting not necessarily that you get more sleep than you think, but it might be different than you think. It may be that you're actually sleeping during those first 2 hours, and or you're catching up some other way. But and I think it's just important that if you have these things you really try and map them out as scientifically as you can, because that's the only way you can really address them, right? And if it turns out that you actually are getting 6 hours sleep, not 3.5, then you might be less worried about that than if it turns out you really are getting 3.5.
It's funny that it's why my wife has stopped looking at her Fitbit to get her sleep data, because she would wake up. This happened to her multiple times, and then she read online that this is becoming a thing for people. She would wake up feeling like she'd had a great night's sleep and feels rested and, let's go kick some ass and take on the world. And then she'd look at her Fitbit data and it would say, you got 4.5 hours. And then in her head, there's a part of her head that goes, oh, that explains why I feel like crap. Well, wait a minute. You didn't feel like crap before you looked at your numbers. Wait a minute. What's going on? Let's circle back around just to wrap up. Tell me, so you mentioned the online test that people can find. You mentioned your book. Let's cover off all of the different places where people can find you, find information, and link to the study that you talked about as well.
Yeah. So the study of sleep, we used some software that was developed in my lab called Cambridge Brain Sciences. We called that because we started developing it when I was back in Cambridge in the UK. You can find it by going to Cambridge Brain Sciences. CambridgeSciences.com, all one word, and that will take you to the so-called public site where people can try the tests. They can set up an account for themselves and try tests, and then see what happens when they get too much sleep or not enough sleep, see how it actually affects them. And if you want to do more or get more into it, then contact the guys on the website. They're very responsive, and they'll get back to you, and they'll give you access to more bells and whistles that you can try at home and to follow your cognition. It's a very good way of following your cognition. And for that matter, it doesn't have to be, as I said at the beginning of this interview, I do a lot more than sleep. If you're just interested in knowing how your cognitive function stacks up to other people of your age and background, then the website can tell you how to do that. If you want to know how other things are affecting your cognition, I don't know, other habits you have that you think might be dulling your senses or affecting your ability to think, again, do it scientifically. Test it out on the website before you have any assume too much about these things. So there's a lot there that people can do. My book was called Into the Grey Zone. It has a subtitle, A Neuroscientist Explores the Border Between Life and Death. It's a popular science book, so it's not really, you don't have to be a scientist to read it. It's about all of these issues of consciousness and vegetative state and coma, and whether these patients are aware or not aware, and how you can measure them, all told as a story of the last sort of 20 years of my life, both scientifically and personally, because there are aspects of things that happened in my personal life that fed into that. So it's a scientific story, if you like, but I think it's a good introduction to consciousness and consciousness research and that sort of thing.
And to completely fly in the face of most of what we think about Twitter, you're on Twitter as well. Where do we find you?
I'm on Twitter, yes. My Twitter handle I adopted very early on. I'm not sure whether it was a good decision, but it's Comadork, Comadork. I'm
Sure.
Comadork on Twitter. Yeah, I tweet about mostly work stuff, stuff to do with sleep or consciousness or vegetative state or cognition. It's mostly about that sort of stuff here. So people can find me there. I also have a website with a lot of information about what goes on in my lab. It's owenlab.org. You can find me here at the University of Western Ontario. So we have a lot of online information, and people can always find a way to get in touch if they want more information.
I wanted to make sure that for the very first interview on the show, I brought out a heavy hitter. So thank you for being exactly that heavy hitter. Thanks for making time for this.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And I'll touch base with you when the sleep test results come back. See if your prediction came true.
Please do. I look forward to it.
There you go, Dr. Adrian Owen, our first official guest here on the Snooze Button. We're going to put a ton of links and information about Dr. Owen in the show notes, but just to quickly reiterate and recap before you follow him on Twitter at Comadork. It's COMADORK. The test he was talking about you can find at CambridgeBrainSciences.com. You got to click a couple links to get there. You're looking for one that says, check out our tasks. You click on that, you go down the page, you see a number of tests there you can take right on your computer right now. We'd appreciate it if you could take a second, rate and review us. You can go to ratethispodcast.com/snooze. That's in the show notes as well. If you like throwing us a couple bucks like the other bedheads to support the work that we're doing, very easy to do. glow.fm/the snooze button. Again, in the show notes and on our website at thesnoozebutton.com. That's it for this week. Again, I'm Neil Headley. We'll see you next week for episode 3. But in the meantime, hey, get some sleep, would you?